April 1945, off Kyushu dawn. The sea is pewter flat and the destroyer's bridge hums with routine bearings, called coffee, cooling the watch officer sketching neat geometry in his head for the usual threats: high bombers, steep divers, slow torpedo planes. Then the binocular circle fills with something wrong. Two black noses low and level, no greenhouse glass, no polite bombardier, just blunt jaws. The first tongue of fire rips across the foredeck like a zipper of light. Gauges burst. Signal halyards spray splinters. 8 Brownings speak together, a factory rhythm in metal. The officer shouts a turn that never quite arrives. The ship's fine directors want seconds, the attackers offer fractions. A second pair slides in, noses barely twitching, and the bridge windows dust into glitter. Rockets, someone cries, but the guns alone are carpenters, sawing steel at mast height. The watch officer, Itajima trained, precise, feels doctrine collapse in 6 seconds. Whatever this is, it is not nuisance strafing. It is an instrument designed to erase the interval between sighting and dying. He writes one thought on the back of his mind: we were not warned about this. They had been certain. The catalogue of American air threats was tidy, memorized at school and rehearsed at sea. Heavy bombers announced themselves miles high time, for plots, lead angles, the comfort of mathematics. Dive bombers screamed, but their steep arcs could be read and answered with predicted fire. Torpedo planes crept in low on rails of water. A destroyer's speed and quick helm were the cure. The instruments, the beautiful directors, the rangefinders were built to make chaos legible if the enemy respected categories. Confidence was not vanity alone. It came from craft. Japanese destroyermen knew their ships turned sharp, their crews drilled hard, their light AA snarled a respectable wall. The watch teams trusted manuals and habit spot, classify assigned the proper remedy. When carrier raids thickened the sky, they had a playbook. When solitary marauders probed at dusk, there was another. The officer of the deck wore that certainty like armor. Geometry would save them if courage held. And then realities began to fray. Reports filtered north from battered escorts and coasters, concentrated nose fire of unusual density. Approaches so flat they seemed to skim the breath off the sea, control tops shredded before orders could reach the guns. At first, these were filed as exaggerations from rattled men. The doctrine left little room for a twin-engined attacker that did not dive, did not torpedo, did not pause to aim, only arrived with a mouth full of guns and a speed that turned seconds into a currency the directors could not spend. Certainty held until the first pass proved the catalogue incomplete. Before the black-nosed strangers arrived, Japanese officers laughed in private at America's attack bomber problem. They knew the pattern: low-level marauders with greenhouse noses, a bombardier hunched over delicate optics, 4 or 6 machine guns scattered, wide wing route harmonization, sloppy below 200 feet. Such aircraft bled speed when they dropped, wallowed in their own prop wash, and needed long, obvious run-ins. A destroyer with a quick helm could knife its wake across that line and throw off aim. A trained 25mm team could rake a fragile nose and make the pilot flinch. Doctrine said, break their rhythm, and they become clumsy visitors, loud, brief, survivable. They also read the Americans as dependent on categories and comfort. Skip bombers, predictable angles, count the seconds, seed the water with tracers, watch them bounce into their own spray. Rocket shooters, fine rockets, telegraph themselves with rails and weight. The airplane balloons, the Pippa drifts. Low-altitude guns, a nuisance. Dispersed muzzles meant dispersed fire. And always the same supposed weaknesses. Glass up front, a crewman exposed. Engines that would cough when the prop bit dense sea air. Pilots overtrained to stay alive, not bred to trade paint with mastheads. From the bridge, the arithmetic looked friendly. The destroyer's silhouette was small. Her directors were quick enough. Her speed could snatch a fresh aspect faster than a twin-engine attacker could correct. Even the sea favored the defender. Chop could kick a strafing pass into a porpoise, rip accuracy into scallops. If the Americans came, they would come as they always had: shallow confidence in speed, a tidy division of roles, a visible moment when a man up front had to aim through glass and pray. So they mocked not out of blind arrogance, but out of experience that seemed to repeat. The enemy's low flyers had been manageable nuisances. The catalogue had no entry for a machine that solved every listed weakness by removing the glass stuffing all the muzzles into one jaw and holding level like a blade on a whetstone. Night surrenders slowly in the straits. The destroyer's crew tastes metal and salt and old charcoal from last week's shore bombardment. They have learned to fear silence more than sirens. Silence means the plotboard is clean, The headphones are too quiet, the lookout's murmurs have settled into that trance where the sea becomes a single surface without features. Silence means imagination rehearses death in perfect detail while reality withholds its cues. Men wait badly, even trained men. The forward 25mm mount captain counts each breath to keep time from pooling in his chest. A signalman wipes the same salt from the same rail twice. The officer of the deck checks his watch too often, then hides it so he will stop checking. Somewhere aft a mess, cook swears he hears an engine that no one else hears. The bosun calls him a fool and listens harder. Radar gives little comfort at mast height. The coast throws back echoes. Low flyers blend with clutter. What the ship needs is a gap in the enemy's will. What it receives is a gap in sound. The storm, when it comes, will be short, so short that a man will later be unable to explain how his hands moved between the first shout and the second. But the problem is older than the past that will end it. The Americans have learned to put violence where prediction fails. Their engineers did not merely add guns, they removed the interval. Their logisticians did not merely send airplanes, they taught squadrons to repeat the trick until routine made courage unnecessary. The destroyer knows none of this in words. It feels it as dread. Across the water somewhere beyond the lip of the world, a coral dust airstrip boils with a careful, practiced hurry. Armorers feed belts, crew chiefs run fingers along cowl flaps, pilots close canopies with the soft domestic click of a door at home. A chalk line on a map points at a shipping lane. A lieutenant briefs no loiter, 2 passes jaws first, rockets if needed. The untold problem for the Americans had been simple to phrase and hard to solve: how to erase a destroyer's mind, director's voice lines, bridge glass before the ship can think. They solved it by making thinking unnecessary on their side. Back on the destroyer, silence reaches its highest pitch, the moment before metal becomes language. A faint tremor arrives on the air, like a rumor told through a wall. The lookout leans forward. The officer of the deck feels the deck, not the wind. He opens his mouth to order a turn he has not yet earned. The sea continues pretending to be calm, and then the calm tears as if a seam had been hidden in the horizon and someone pulled it with both hands. Across the water beyond the curve of the world that the destroyer's bridge could not see, the American answer had already been built, not as a single marvel, but as a system tuned to erase the interval in which an enemy might think. It began far from salt air, inside brick and glass and steel places with names that sounded ordinary. Long Beach, Tulsa, El Segundo, Omaha. There lines of men and women threaded cartridges into canvas belts. Presses kissed aluminum into ribs. Templates turned chaos into sameness. The war's arithmetic was set first in factories, and the A-26 Invader was one of its cleanest equations, a twin-engine airframe with speed like a dare and a nose that was not a face at all, but a jaw. The impossible idea did not look like genius at a drafting table. It looked like a refusal to be delicate. Strip the greenhouse, remove the vulnerable bombardier bubble the enemy always aimed at. Fill the void with guns, not 2, not 4, but 8 heavy Brownings aimed so tightly that a pilot's smallest correction would walk a zipper of metal across a target the size of a bridge window. Let the wings host more muzzles if needed. Let the belly carry parafrags or 500-pounders. Let the outer hardpoints wear 5-inch HVAR rockets like fangs. Give it the Pratt & Whitney R2800, a 2-row 18-cylinder anvil that turned gasoline into intention. Then polish the rest until it forgave tired hands. But preparation at scale is theater, not diagram. In the Western Pacific, a hot wind always moved. On coral airstrips, crew chiefs walked the invaders' skins with the intimacy of farriers, fingertips reading buckles and rivet lines. At dawn, they opened the jaw-hinged panels, lifting to reveal feed chutes and welded cradles, and they fed the machine draping belts over the breeches until brass and link formed a gentle U like a hymn's curve on paper. Armorers palmed the cool weight of 50 cal rounds, checking for bad crimps. They spoke to each other in spare clauses as if economy of language would teach economy of error. Pilots learned the airplane the way a carpenter learns a plane, by shaving. They lifted into bright air and stayed low on purpose, skimming shorelines, letting the Pipper stroll over driftwood and rocks, then over derelict hulls, then after a time over barges that were not derelict at all. They practiced harmonization until the 8 streams met like a fist at a chosen distance: 150 yards for chewing decks, 250 for killing cars, 350 for anything that needed a respectful standoff. They learned to enter a run without the waste of a wide setup to hold 270 knots at mast height with the same attention a surgeon gives to pulse to manage manifold pressure and prop RPM so the engines sang together instead of fighting. The briefings were short and plain. A lieutenant's chalk found the day's geometry a shipping lane bent along a promontory, a picket line drawn thin by fuel and fatigue, a cove where barges hid among scaffolds of reeds and timbers. No loiter, he said. 2 passes, Jaws' first glass signal directors, rockets if the target lives and has the nerve to show you steel. He did not speak about courage, he spoke about sequence. Sequence was the art, first the eyes, then the brains, then the throat. If the destroyer could not see and could not talk and could not breathe, the rest of the ship armor speed doctrine would simply be a body waiting for grief. Elsewhere in the theater, men in bigger ships prepared a different set of jaws. Cruisers rehearsed shore bombardment tables, battleships massaged their tons of cordial math, the kind that turned shorelines into grids. The Navy's firepower and the Air Force's low-level precision did not always kiss in doctrine, but in practice they learned to nod at the same moment's bombardment, to pin and blind attack planes, to cut infantry to enter. The Americans did not fetishize a single arm, they choreographed instruments. Back on the hardstand, the ritual finished with fingers. Pilots bumped their trim-tested flaps, no more than a tooth, for the run-in rocked the stick, and watched the sight ring steady. Crew chiefs slapped the nacelles as old sailors slap a hull. The jaw closed, cowl flaps settled, props blurred. A man squinted into the prop wash and tasted grit and fuel and a sweetness that lived at the edge of nausea. The Invader rolled light on its struts, and then it did the thing it was made to do. It left. In the air, the formation was not elegant. It was effective. Pairs worked like scissors, one blade then the other, so that a target forced to turn away from one would show the wrong side to the next. Communications were sparse, radios lied in battle, and the shoreline ate words. Instead, the men trusted intervals, a heartbeat's pause that kept wakes from stacking, that kept tracers from becoming fences the second pair would fly into. They trusted discipline. If the first pass did not finish the work, the second would start with what the first had ruined. If rockets were reserved for punctuation, the punctuation would be legible. All of this belts harmonization chalk. Hand signals, the quiet nods before canopies slid, was the preparation colossal. Not gaudy colossal, because the point of colossal was not size alone. It was repeatability. The Americans prepared not to astonish once, but to arrive again. Factories kept the conveyor moving, depots watered the conveyor, troop ships delivered new hands to learn old moves. Maintenance manuals taught old moves to new hands with recipes so simple a man could follow them after 2 hours of sleep. If one airplane bent a wheel on a coral lip, another would take its place after lunch. If one squadron's gunners wore a barrel out of true, the armorer's crate held the fresh throat the gun needed. Even the choice of 8 had been preparation. 8 did not mean waste. It meant margin. If one gun choked when salt found it, the other 7 spoke. If a pilot's run drifted half a degree high, hard to avoid over-hot air that bucked 8 mouths, could pull the burst back into the deck with brutality disguised as grace. The airplane could carry bombs, yes, and did. It could fire rockets, yes, and did. But the jaw up front became the daily dependable trick, the thing a squadron could learn so well that fear forgot where to live in a man's hands. The impossible idea present violence before thought was not mystical. It was manufacturable. It was hand-tightenable. It came with parts lists and grease. It could be repeated on Monday and then on Wednesday, and then again under another cloud line at another longitude, against another destroyer whose watch officer had memorized a catalogue that no longer described the world. America prepared by making preparation the weapon. The Invader was simply the shape that weapon took when it had to fly low, speak in metal, and leave before a director's wheels finished their first turn. And so the day that the destroyer waited for, without knowing its name, April and the inland sea arrived. On the American side of the horizon, the chalk stroke pointed. Engines found the note that meant we're going. The men who would own the next 6 seconds did not think they were heroes. They believed they were competent. Competence multiplied by fuel and parts and drills and runway became something the enemy would call shock. But to the men wearing headphones and leather and dust, it felt like work, the kind of work you do until you can do it half asleep, and then you never let yourself try it half asleep. They slid down to the seam between sky and water. The world went from map to texture. The jaw faced forward. The sight curled a ring around a future it would puncture. And somewhere ahead on a bridge that smelled of rope and varnish and the tiredness of men, doctrine shifted inside an officer's chest without his consent. The Americans had prepared for that too. The attack did not begin with a shot. It began with placement, the art of being exactly where the enemy's tools are worst. At 50 feet over grey water, the horizon moves like a rumour. Masts rise late, directors spin late, rangefinders stall between numbers. The invaders came along that seam and stayed there because their wings held them steady and their engines forgave their pilots for working so near the ground. Mast height is not a number, it is a habit. The formation split to respect the shoreline, 2 pairs curving left to keep sun glare behind them, 1 pair holding centerline to pin the destroyer's bow. A last look, manifold pressure, good props high, but not screaming cowl flaps, a click from close to keep cylinders cool enough to live through a long run. The leader's thumb kissed the gun selector, 8 breeches sat tight, springs coiled belts laid in smooth arcs. The sight's pipper drifted, then settled, then drifted. The right amount of drift is what separates a butcher from a carpenter. First pass eyes, the muzzle's tunneled flame. The sound up front was not heroic, it was industrial, a loom tearing cloth. At the bow glass burst outward. Bridge windows turned to powder that hung for a human heartbeat and then vanished in wind. The signal halyards snapped in several places at once. Their ropes wrote brief cursive letters across air and then let go. The destroyer's crew did what men do, duck-rise reach for telephones that were now rattling, speak into tubes that now hissed. The invader did what a machine does. It traced the line it had been taught, walked the tracers left to right across the face of command, then right to left to make sure. A director tries to make chaos legible, but only if it can see. The first bursts found the director, hoods their thin metal designed for weather, not for hate. Panels dimpled, then peeled, tracers climbed the stanchions like angry insects. Inside the cramped spaces where men cranked and cooled bearings, paint dust raised a grey breath. A man sneezed blood. The ship turned, of course it turned, but turn radius is a stubborn thing when the rudder bites late and the wake pulls. Second pass voice. The second pair came in a heartbeat, behind the way scissors do one blade, then the other. Their pippers favoured the voice lines, the sound-powered phones draped along bulkheads, the exposed runs toward the forward mounts, the radio house itself. The jaws' 8 streams closed on each other and chewed the ready-use lockers before the men inside could decide whether they were brave or merely shocked. Splinters flew not wood, but steel-thin and unwilling to remain whole under such a tension. A petty officer rose into view with a handset and fell backward without a sound anyone could later remember. Rocket rails burned white on the next pair, HVAR 5-inch, the American habit of ending arguments. But rockets do not earn their keep unless the target can still think, and the invaders were making thought expensive. The rockets held their peace. The jaw liked clean work. It used bullets like a whisk. Third-pass hands. The leader rolled shallow to change the picture for the gun crews who had finally wrestled their mounts toward the attackers. Depression angles laughed at them. At mast height, the attackers were too low for some guns to stoop without shooting their own ship. Those that could fire stitched the air with 25mm teeth, useful but too late. The invaders' bursts walked the mounts, hammered elevation gears, cut the traverse lines, mapped an X on the thin armor around a loader's chest. He crumpled in a spasm that looked like a shrug. The destroyer's fire control team had trained to weigh, lead and lag to solve for speed and aspect. None of their chalkboard problems had told them how to answer a line of fire already inside their skin. The beautiful wheels spun for pride, if not for function. Someone shouted rocket now, and the fourth machine obliged at last, not because it was required, but because punctuation belongs where grammar demands. 2 HVARs rose off the rails with the flat mechanical nonchalance of a tool leaving a bench, and struck further aft one against the after superstructure, tearing away antennas and sending a sheet of flame sideways the other into an area near the torpedo reloads where the ship's plans became smoke. A destroyer is not fragile in the way a wooden boat is fragile. It is fragile in the way a nervous system is fragile. Blind, the eyes numb, the mouth cut the nerves, and the muscles only twitch. The invaders wrote that lesson in lines anyone could read. By the time the 5th airplane rolled in to assess the ship's turn had become a wobble. Men still moved, men always move, but the movement no longer belonged to a plan, only to stubbornness. Over the horizon, other theaters spoke in deeper voices. A cruiser's 8-inch batteries walked shells along a shore road in punctuation at the end of a paragraph. Further out, battleships pounded capes and caves with shells that made the sea slap itself awake. That was the Navy's grammar period's exclamation points, sometimes entire pages ripped from the coastline. The Air Force's mast-height grammar looked modest by comparison, but it had its own boldness, commas and em-dashes delivered at 260 knots, places where thought would have gone sacrificed so action could proceed unopposed. Now the sequence matured. With the bridge glass gone, with the talkers down, with the mounts stunned, the remaining passes could choose the throat. Not the hull that took heavier punctuation, but the places where steam and fire became motive power, uptake hoods, ventilators, exposed piping fuel lines that tasted like opportunity. A short burst into an open vent is a cruel education. The flames that leap out are not always spectacular, but they are domestic. The kind of fire that knows how to spread into corners and eat soft things first, while men chase it with shouts and pails. The leader waved off. Discipline had a clock. No loiter, no victory laps. To stay would be to invite the few guns that still had depression to earn a medal. The pair banked with that loose-hipped grace twin-engine ships have when their weight agrees with their lift, and the sea under their bellies blurred into a single skin again. Behind them, the destroyer, still alive, still dangerous to anyone who loved her, trailed a confetti of glass and a brushstroke of smoke that would tell repair crews an honest story. Elsewhere along the coast, other jaws worked other problems. Barges crowding into a cove felt the 8-gun nose as numbers, not as drama, 3 seconds of burst, and then men rowing among crates suddenly found the crates coming apart around them as if someone had changed the definition of wood. A lighthouse used by range-finding parties became a column with holes, an organ pipe gone tone-deaf. A train that had learned to hug shadow ran out into sunlight for 12 heartbeats and learned how quickly sunlight can turn to hail. From above, if you could climb into the leader's mind between runs, you would not find poetry. You would find checklists, sight picture good, drift acceptable, recoil manageable, keep the nose from climbing when the Brownings bite. Watch for prop torque at the bottom of the run. A heavy hand will drag the left wing. Respect the pylons if you carry rockets. Do not be the man who forgets drag and wonders why his pipper lies. Trust the harmonization, do not search, settle. Never chase tracers, they are late to their own party. On the destroyer, later men would say that the airplanes hovered over the deck like insects. That was an illusion the Invader cultivated on purpose, the feeling of inevitability that comes when a machine holds its line so cleanly that the human eye mistakes steadiness for stillness. In truth, air never forgives. Every foot of altitude regained at the pullout must be bought with speed and nerve, and a margin the pilot keeps in his pocket for surprises. A mast that grows taller than a chart predicted an eddy of hot air that lifts the right wingtip, a handspan at the wrong moment, a tracer that flashes near a spinner and begs for attention. The Invader's secret sauce made the purchase affordable. Strong wings, honest controls, engines that would not sulk, a sight that did not lie. After the run, there is always a second war maintenance. The jaw returns to the line and opens. Armorers pull belts that smell of warm oil and burnt powder. A crew chief runs a brass brush through places where carbon pretends to be future trouble. A gunner swaps a barrel that has grown soft from heat for one with new rifling that still bites. Someone finds a cracked mount and does not write a sonnet. He finds a wrench. The airplane is an instrument you can keep in tune with parts and practice. That more than speed or sleekness is how it wins a campaign that lasts longer than a memory. And what of the men? They are not statues, they are systems too. Training replaced a portion of fear with procedure. The pilot's fear becomes check RPM once more. The navigator's fear becomes mark the cove with a grease pencil X. The armorer's fear becomes count to 120 as the belts feed so your hands are ready for the next. When fear is domesticated into steps, it leaves just enough wildness for judgment, the part that chooses to abort a run when the deck rises wrong, that saves an airplane, that saves a man, that keeps the next squadron from inheriting a ghost. If you stitched all of this together, the factory floors where rivets clicked like metronomes, the depots where drums of fuel evolved into sorties, the training ranges where pippers met oil barrels until the barrels learned to fear geometry, the coral strips where dust lived in men's teeth, the low approaches where sea and sky became a single argument. You would name it preponderance and you would be right. But if you asked the destroyer's watch officer, who is bleeding from the ear and still calling bearings out of habit, he might pick a different word, inevitability. Because the secret sauce is not that the Invader can kill a ship by itself, it often cannot not, without help from a rocket or a bomb or a friend in a bigger ship. The source is that it removes the ship's mind so quickly that every other American instrument rocket bomb cruiser troop wave arrives to work on a patient already anesthetized. And that was the day's truth. Along this grey edge of Japan, the sea lay pewter flat, but it was not calm. It was a conveyor. Along it ran men and steel and doctrine, American and Japanese each convinced of their own grammar. The Invader wrote a new punctuation at the height of a mast and taught everyone to read faster. The destroyer still floated when the last airplane left, and men with wrenches and torches would later dress her wounds so she could try again under a different sun. But in the 6 seconds that mattered, the bridge learned a lesson it could not unlearn. Some enemies do not argue. They edit. April 1945. Inland sea, first light. The destroyer's bridge breathes in small human noises. Boots creak, pencils scratch, a kettle ticks on the galley plate below. Then the first burst arrives like a ripped curtain. Glass disintegrates inward in a glittering exhale. Paint dust turns the air the color of old bone. Someone shouts bearing, but the word is chopped by metal syllables that do not care about language. The officer of the deck feels the deck tilt under the helmsman's hands and hears not the roar of aircraft, which is everywhere and nowhere, but the mechanical lope of 8 guns speaking in time, a mill that has found a knot in the wood and is happy to eat. Control dies in fragments. A talker at the starboard wing reaches for his sound-powered phone and finds a frayed rope where a line used to be. The gunnery officer leans into a director hood already shedding petals of steel. His world is a circle of sight that fills with white dust, a black muzzle flash, and a tracer that crawls across the sight like a lizard. Shift to local control, he says, and down the line the command becomes a rumor. The men at the forward mounts have no ears left, only eyes wide as coins and hands that know how to load by feel. The ship turns, because ships always turn when fear asks them to. Rudder goes over, the wake draws a white question mark behind the stern, but the attackers do not respect punctuation. The second pair arrives before the helm reaches its answer. They come in lateral, surfing a sheet of air so flat the bow wave itself seems taller, and they chew where orders live. The radio house door jumps under the impacts, the roof skitters away, the coax antenna loses its mind and becomes wire again. A petty officer lifts a handset already dead and cries bridge into its mouth like a prayer. The handset is a stone. Down on the main deck, men crouch behind splinter shields designed for weather and shrapnel, not for a river of 50 caliber fire. The shields ring like gongs. The 25mm crew face towels jammed under helmets against the grit muscle, the mount down to depression, then curse when the elevating gear jumps its worn teeth and kicks the muzzle too low. A loader's thumb splits on the lip of an ammo box. Blood slicks the brass. He forgets what pain is because the mount captain is banging the shield with his fist and screaming for feed, feed, feed. When the gun finally speaks, the tracers carve commas in the air 3 ship lengths ahead of the attackers. The commas do not change the sentence. Sparks draft across the bridge like fireflies with intent. The chart today's rocks buoys, coastal silhouettes, lifts, flutters, sticks to a breathless man's cheek. Engine room bridge, the officer calls into the voice tube and gets a rush of hot air that smells of oil and varnish and fear. Report. A faraway voice begins calm as trained, all shafts turning no, and then the tube coughs as if it has caught the same cold as the radio. The officer wants distance space to think the noble altitude of an admiral's map table. What he has is a hand on a brass rail and a steadying knee, and the discipline to speak in whole sentences while the world is being sawn into coins. The third pair rolls in with a slice of sun on their canopies. A gunner, short, strong, always whistling at mess and never off-key, stands to traverse faster and is punched back into his life in a heap. The smell changes. Pure powder smoke is bitter clean. Now there is something sugary at the edges. A smell men know without wanting to know it, burning insulation paint heated to memory. Fire forward. Someone calls and a second voice follows fire aft as if the ship were practicing antiphonal singing. Men appear with hoses and vanish in spray and steam and shouts. The roll of the ship has gone odd, not yet wrong, but suggestive. Water for the hoses is a tug at the keel. Rockets. This time it is not a false alarm. The fourth machine carries rails and offers punctuation. 2 white streaks lift off like bored birds and find the after superstructure with the confidence of men who have drawn this picture 100 times on a blackboard. The hit is not cinematic. The ship does not break. But the blow catches a tangle of aerials and turns them into spaghetti. It blows open lockers that held things that should have stayed private. It draws a whoop from the fire that has been nursing itself and now sees oxygen like an inheritance. The officer of the deck does something he will not remember. Later, he laughs once a single bright bark because the wheel answers his hands too late and because the thing he is seeing refuses to be fitted into the pegs drilled into his head at school. Behind him, the signalman, whose left ear is bleeding in a neat trickle down a neck that his mother used to kiss, clambers on all fours, trying to get the emergency flag locker open with fingers that make no bargains. He will hoist a flag upside down, no one will notice. The wind will take it like a stolen handkerchief. After two stokers who have never cared for the bridge and its pretty instruments become kings. They close a door that wants to be open because the door keeps the pump room breathable. They carry a hose like a wounded man and do arithmetic with valves by touch. They do not know the name of the airplane that is turning their ship into bad language. They only know the weight of water and the way a deck talks through boots when a ship is thinking about being something else. The fifth pass is not a pass. The fifth airplane is a mirror held up to the destroyer's face. It banks and lingers just long enough to confirm the diagnosis. Eyes blinded, mouth, broken hands, shaking. It puts a short burst into the places where a man with a wrench would go first if he wanted to make the ship better. This makes the man with the wrench later. Then it is gone, lifting into a sky that has acquired the tone of a forged blade. Command does not collapse in one gesture, it shreds. Orders shrink from orchestrations to errands. Port pump, clothes that know the other you with me, the executive officer who once wrote poems at school, becomes a man of verbs, fetch, carry, shut, turn, drag. He will think later that the verbs saved lives. He will also think later that the verbs were the apology the ship made to its crew for inviting them to a fight where seconds did not belong to them anymore. In the radio silence, rumors breed like fruit flies, even among professionals. More coming. They're circling for torpedoes. It's the same too. It's 6. No one knows because knowledge used to live in the shivering glass of instruments and in the tidy calls of men with headsets. Now knowledge is a line of smoke that says you hurt and a heat that says you might. The doctor, an ordinary seaman with a box of dressings and a legitimate fear of blood, finds two men in the shadow of a bulkhead and experiences the peculiar calm that visiting horror sometimes brings. He stabilizes one, lies to another, kindly moves on. At the director, the gunnery officer keeps speaking because it is his religion. Forward local short bursts, watch your tracers, don't chase them. He knows he is preaching to a collapsed choir. He knows words fill air and occupation fills fear's pockets. He will not stop. When a shard of something trivial as a coin and as convincing cuts a line across his cheek, he wipes it away with the back of his hand and leaves a biblical smear under his eye that makes him look like a man already memorialized. Time folds. The entire engagement approach, first cut, second cut, punctuation departure, will later occupy less space in memory than a decent song. But the ship acquires a new geography forever. Here is where the bridge learned humility. Here is where the hose kinked. Here is where a loader left his thumbprint in dried blood on a mount that would later be painted. And in that paint, the thumbprint would live like a fossil no one mentioned. The officer of the deck at last hears himself say, "Belay all firing," except to bear, and realizes the ship is shooting at ghosts at air that is embarrassed to be empty. Silence returns the way cats enter rooms as if it had always been there. Men cough the ship's new dust and taste it for what it is, doctrine ground to flour. The horizon is shy, the wake is a torn ribbon. The bridge looks like a room where something private happened fast and without consent. The officer takes a breath, catches the staleness of his own fear in it, and speaks in his normal voice, engineering bridge. All available power to pumps, prepare to be taken in tow. The tube answers with a man's voice that stands upright. It is the loveliest sound in the world. Below in the hot belly, a machinist's mate smacks a stubborn valve with a spanner and thinks not of glory, not of the emperor, not of death, but of how good rice will taste when this shift ends. Above, the signalman finally wins his duel with the flag locker and raises a square of cloth that says nothing, doctrine recognizes, and everything men do. On the water bits of the bridge glass, a pencil, a map corner, a blue cap drift like the long thoughts of a mind interrupted. The ship has not died, she has been edited, and in the editing, a ruthless red pencil that struck through eyes and voice and hands lives the lesson that will move like a fever through the fleet. The enemy learned to put violence where our mathematics cannot spend in time. The sky holds its breath, then exhales. Far off, another pair of dots skims the seam. The helmsman glances at the officer of the deck, and the officer shakes his head once slow, steady. He is not brave. He is finished with bravery for the morning. He is a clerk again, counting what is left and preparing a ledger that the shipyard will read like a confession. The trial is not by fire alone. It is by tempo. And the tempo was set somewhere beyond the horizon, in places that never smell salt and yet rule it. The realization does not arrive as a trumpet. It arrives as a ledger. After the smoke thins and the hoses stop writhing and the burned insulation surrenders its sweetness, men start counting. The list is not dramatic. 2 talkers deaf, 1 likely permanent, radio house a ruin, bridge glass no longer a thing, forward ready-use lockers open to the weather and to opinion. 1 elevation gear on the starboard 5mm mount behaving like an old man's knee, paint scorched bare in petals wherever tracers licked. 2 small fires killed, 1 sulking behind a bulkhead and scheduled to be strangled by an axe. The ship floats. The pumps work. The screws still turn, but the column that used to read command is now a line of zeros. Out on the grey, the American planes are already small, their tails stacked like coins. They do not circle for photographs. They do not wag wings. They are going somewhere else that needs the same sentence. And that is where the understanding begins, not in what the enemy did, but in how little the enemy needed to tell you he could do it again. A destroyer's mind is its speed, plus its sensors, plus its voice. In school, the officer learned that speed buys angles, sensors buy time, voice buys coordination. The enemy came to the exchange and bought those 3 items out of the shop before the clerk could hang the open sign. The enemy did not have to sink the ship only to cheaply erase minutes. When minutes are erased, everything expensive armor plate, drilled crews, lovely directors tries to pay with a currency the enemy no longer accepts. He thinks of the catalogue: heavy bombers predictable, dive bombers understandable, torpedo planes interceptable if seen early. None of the catalogue spoke of an airplane that arrived in the seam between categories and turned categories into ornaments. He feels cheated in a childish way and then ashamed of that feeling. War is not a market where you can accuse the other man of mislabeling his goods. War is a machine that rewards men who build better machines. He glimpses the machine now, and it is not the airplane alone. The airplane is a mouth. Behind the mouth is a stomach, factories with conveyor belts, depots with drums of fuel shaped like promises, training fields where boys practice until fear becomes choreography. Behind the stomach is a spine ships that bring charts that align officers who write simple orders that ordinary hands can obey. Behind the spine is something like weather culture habit, a national way of deciding that if 8 guns cut better than 6 fit 8, and making it so without an argument that lasts longer than a lunch. He knows his own machine. It is beautiful and tired. Fuel is a negotiation. Spare parts are a wish. Training hours are a tragedy. The men do not speak aloud. Instructors who have never bled trying to teach boys how not to bleed. Boys learning too slowly because fuel is counted like pearls. The radar sees when the coast does not lie. The coast lies often. The guns are brisk when they speak. They sulk when they are asked to stoop. They break and wait for a shipyard that is also counting pennies and miracles. Men tell each other stories to make sense of this. At mess, a coxswain says he has a cousin who was captured in the South and sent to a camp in America, and that the cousin wrote before the censors smudged it, that the prisoners were fed meat, that the guards were bored, that trucks arrived when trucks were wanted, that milk was cold. The mess laughs because laughing is cheaper than envy. But the story sticks, and after mornings like this one, it provides a frame. The Americans are not brave because they eat meat. They are brave because they do not have to be brave every hour. Their machines carry fear for them. Fear is heavy. A nation that can carry it on conveyor belts wins wars by longevity. On the bridge, the executive officer writes, he will make a report that does not moan measured clipped attack by low-flying twin-engine enemy aircraft. Heavy concentrated nose fire, bridge glass destroyed, communications cut, fire control impaired, 2 rockets impacting after superstructure, casualties listed by rate and name. The report will travel up a chain of command that understands bravery and shortages and will file it in a drawer where similar reports have been accumulating into a new doctrine that no one has time to publish before the war ends. If they arrive with seconds to spend, we must learn to own seconds. If we cannot, we must learn to live without minds. He steps to the wing and looks at the sea. It is back to pewter. It is always back to pewter. Calm is the most discouraging thing because calm is what the enemy uses as a runway. Far down the coast, a smudge suggests a village or a fire or both. The sky holds nothing visible. The sky does not have to today. The men who hurt them have gone somewhere else. They can hurt not because they are blood mad, but because a chalk line on a board told them to, and the chalk line exists because a staff officer with a calendar and fuel tables and convoy schedules can afford to write in abundance instead of in hope. A young seaman joins him, asks permission to speak, and says without drama that he thought today would be like other days, which were also hard, but that today felt like the enemy had decided to be a profession instead of a surprise. The executive officer wants to laugh at the phrasing because it is perfect, and because laughter will hurt. He says instead, it is a profession. He means the enemy has turned killing into a business that can be franchised from one coastline to the next. Same recipe, same oven, same bread. Repair begins. The ship's company becomes a small army of plumbers. The wounded are tucked into the ship's quieter places where they stare at painted bulkheads that have never been so interesting. The dead, fewer than they feared, more than their mothers can bear, wait for a beach and a priest, or the man who does the job when the priest is somewhere else. The radio is a patient, the bridge, a dentist's chair, the deck, a carpenter's bench. Men who have never liked metaphors discover that tools are metaphors you can hold, and the realization deepens into policy personal and bitter. If this is how it is now, if the enemy will arrive with a jaw of guns and take our seconds away, then we must live as if every minute we are given is borrowed from a banker who does not like our face. Drills will be sharper. Hose runs will be straight as oaths. Ammunition boxes will be open before they are needed. The mount captain will sleep with the elevation gears manual under his head. The signalman will fix the flag locker door and oil its hinge until it sings like a well-kept violin. None of this will stop an airplane at 50 feet. All of it will make surviving an airplane at 50 feet more likely. This is not hope. It is arithmetic. He hears footsteps. The captain appears from below, a man who has been lending his hands to valves, because a captain who does that on the first day of a new kind of war finds his crew ready for the second day. He asks for the summary. He receives it without sugar. He nods and says, "We will make port. We will patch. We will go again." He does not add the part he is thinking "we will go again" into a world where the enemy's seconds cost us hours we do not have, and we will continue until the ledger closes for reasons that have more to do with factories than with flags. Tow hawsers come like gentle snakes from a ship that still has her voice. The destroyer humbles herself and accepts the gift. In the wake, the officer of the deck sees glitter that used to be windows and decides he will not write poetry about it. He will write numbers and the names of men who did what verbs demanded. He will write concentrated nose fire of unusual density. The phrase he thought dramatic when he first read it and now thinks cautious. He will write limited return fire due to depression angles, which is the elegant way to say we could not bring our teeth to bear where the biting was done. At dusk, the horizon finds its old trick of pretending to be land. The officer touches the rail and thinks of hands in another country, threading cartridges of boys, learning to keep a sight still, while their hearts do what boys' hearts do, of a chain of things that led to this morning and will lead to another morning for someone else. He does not hate the men in the airplanes. He hates that they belong to a machine that can afford to be ordinary about destruction, to schedule it, to equip it, to train it, to smile politely and leave on time. He writes one more line in his head because paper is scarce at this moment, and memory will do. We were not defeated by an airplane. We were defeated by a system that sent an airplane to where our thoughts were slow, and that will send another tomorrow. Then he closes his eyes for 3 breaths, opens them, and goes back to verbs. The realization is complete. It will not make him braver. It will make him quicker. Sometimes in war, that is all a man can buy with the coins he has left. The destroyer limped home, but the wound traveled further than steel. In staff rooms where maps were pinned with neat violence, the morning's brief engagement was plotted as a small contact time bearing ammunition expended. Yet the effect ran along the whole defense like a crack in ice. The Japanese near-shore plan had rested on 3 legs radar and lookouts to grant minutes fast escorts to bite at intruders and centralized fire control to turn scattered guns into a single mind. The Invaders' method did not argue with those legs. It kicked them out. When minutes became seconds, pickets could not warn. When eyes and talkers were severed in the opening pass, speed was only motion without coordination. When directors were blinded or stunned, a dozen barrels became a dozen frightened instruments. Coastal convoys felt the change first. Routes once hugged at dusk began to look like shooting galleries at noon. Barges learned that camouflage cured distance, not proximity. At mast-height paint is a rumor. Escort skippers already living on short rations of fuel and sleep discovered that the correct tactical response turn hard, throw a narrow target now cost precious situational awareness. They were surviving the first pass only to be stupid for the second, and stupidity under fire is fatal in small bites that add up to strategy. Inland army depots grew jumpy. A single A-26 could not topple a logistics scheme, but squadrons of them reliably repeatedly could force an economy of movement that looked like paralysis. Schedules slid, trains hid. Shore parties defaulted to night and paid the price in confusion and accidents. Doctrine written in years of triumph told units to concentrate for strength. The new reality punished concentration with visibility. Dispersion preserved lives and destroyed plans. The Navy's bigger answers, heavy guns, layered belts of AA training to grimness, still mattered. But they required preparation. The Americans had changed the tempo so that preparation itself became a target. It is hard to rehearsal when your rehearsal hall is under strafing notice. It is hard to replace shattered glass and lines when the next day will shatter them again. Repair ships became chapels of repetition. Their miracles were scheduled, their saints exhausted. Most decisive was the transferability of the lesson. The airplane that edited a destroyer's mind at dawn could that afternoon edit a bridge, a barge train, a signal shack, a lighthouse, pressed into gunnery practice. The same checklist, the same harmonization range, the same disciplined jaws, first punctuation, later. The Americans did not need to invent victory each day, they only needed fuel and barrels. Japan needed answers. Answers require time, and time had been turned into the most expensive commodity in the theater. By summer, the phrase that moved in whispers between ships and bases was simple and corrosive. They owned the seconds. It explained why escorts missed their cues, why convoys arrived light, why commanders wrote orders with more caution than conviction. And it foretold the larger collapse. A strategy that relies on exquisitely managed forces cannot endure a foe who can arrive anywhere and instantly unmanage you. The war machine rolled because it was designed to roll. The defenders, noble and exact, discovered that exactness is a peacetime luxury. Under mast-height arithmetic, only systems that forgive survive. Years later, a surviving watch officer, his hearing ruined in one ear, his handwriting still careful, would be asked what felt new that morning. He did not mention the noise first. He wrote about speed made ordinary. We had met fast things, his line goes, but not a speed that behaved like routine. He listed the ship's injuries in clerkly order, glass lines, directors' men. Then he added a sentence that had not been in any of his wartime reports: they did not look brave. He paused there, and the interviewer asked if he meant to insult them. He shook his head. They looked certain. Another petty officer who spent peacetime repairing radios that never again had to shout over gunfire tried for a joke that was not a joke. We trained to hit a drummer, they brought a metronome. A stoker older now than any of his chiefs had ever been said nothing at first, then tapped his teacup 3 times with a spoon and said, "That is how long it took for our bridge to become weather." If you gather these small testimonies and let them settle, a single sentence floats to the top, the one a young seaman scribbled in a borrowed notebook, because the priest had no paper left that day. "Chúng tôi đang chiến đấu với một cỗ máy." We were fighting a machine. He did not mean a heartless enemy. He meant an arrangement of men and things that carried fear for its pilots, that turned skill into sequence, that converted factories into seconds at 50 feet over grey water. He meant that courage, which his ship had in honest measure, no longer decided mornings. Systems did, and when asked whether he hated the men who flew at him, he said what many of his fellows said: "No. I hated that they could leave and do it again somewhere else before our hoses were coiled." It is not heroic as an epitaph. It is, however, exact, and exactness finally was all he had left to offer.